In January of 2026, something happened that had never happened before. The U.S. Department of Justice essentially unlocked a sealed archive. This was because of a brand new law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and it set off the largest data release in the history of any modern American criminal case. So today, we're going to unpack what was inside, what it all meant, and maybe more importantly, what questions are still left hanging in the air.
You see, this whole thing was presented as this huge moment for transparency. But right away, everyone had the same question. With 3.5 million pages of evidence suddenly out in the open, were we about to get some real answers? Or were we just opening the door to something way, way more complicated? Now, the path to get to this point was, long and incredibly controversial. It really started with that infamous non-prosecution deal back in 2008 in Florida. Things kicked into high gear, of course, with Epstein's arrest and then his death in 2019. And it all led to this pretty rare moment in late 2025 where Congress, on both sides of the aisle, passed a law that forced the government's hand. It legally required them to open up their files. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll start by looking at what was actually inside this massive archive. Then we'll get to the prominent names that popped up. After that, a really critical part of the story, the failures in the release itself. We'll touch on the political fallout, and then we're going to wrap up by asking the big question. Did all this transparency actually bring any real accountability? So first, let's just try to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of what we're talking about here. This was not a small leak or a few key documents. No, this was a digital flood, years and years of sealed investigations all unleashed at once. So let's dig in. What was actually inside this unprecedented release? To really get the picture, you have to start with the numbers. And the main number is just staggering. 3.5 million pages. Just let that number sink in for a second. Think of it this way. If you were to read one page every single minute without sleeping, without stopping, it would take you almost 7 years to get through everything. This wasn't a document dump. It was more like a tidal wave of data. Decades of work all dropped on the public in just a few days. And as you can see here, it was so much more than just text on a page. We're talking about more than 180,000 digital images, over 2,000 video files, and all this information was pulled from 5 completely separate investigations. It took a team of over 500 people at the DOJ just to get it ready for release. So, buried in all those millions of pages, what was actually new? Well, a few big things stood out. The files confirmed that just 2 weeks before he died, Epstein's lawyers were talking about him possibly cooperating with prosecutors. They also revealed a draft indictment from 2007 that we'd never seen before, one that named 3 of his top assistants. And there was more. Dinner invitations to Buckingham Palace from Prince Andrew after his conviction, and even internal FBI charts that tried to map out the horrifying web of victims. But right as they released it all, the Department of Justice put out a critical warning. And this right here, this statement, is the lens through which we have to view everything else. They said, and this is so important, that just because something is in a document, it doesn't automatically mean it's proof of a crime. And that warning brings us to what was, for many people, the most anticipated and definitely the most sensitive part of this whole release. The powerful, high-profile names that were found scattered throughout these millions of pages. Okay, so before we go any further, we have to be absolutely crystal clear on this point. It cannot be said enough. Seeing a name in a flight log or an old email or someone's address book is not, in and of itself, evidence that they did anything wrong. Remember, this archive is a raw collection of everything. Unverified tips, old calendars, notes about notes. Context is everything. So what did the files actually say? Well, Bill Clinton's name showed up in photos and was referenced in depositions. Donald Trump's name was on flight logs from the 90s, and he was the subject of some unverified FBI tips from 2020. Prince Andrew was in there hundreds of times in emails about private dinners. Other names like Elon Musk or Casey Wasserman appeared in messages about social events. I have to say it again. The files document the mention, which is not the same thing as an accusation of wrongdoing. But while the entire world was digging through these files, a huge and, frankly, a deeply disturbing problem started to surface. It turned out that this whole effort to be transparent had created a brand new crisis, and this one was aimed directly at the victims. The promise from the Department of Justice had been a meticulous review to make sure that victim identities were protected. The reality, though,
Well, it was described by victims' attorneys as a catastrophic failure, one that exposed the very people that this whole process was supposed to protect. One survivor, Annie Farmer, she just captured the sense of betrayal perfectly. She called it weaponized incompetence. That feeling that in the rush to get everything out, it was the victim's privacy that was sacrificed, while in some cases, powerful names were still hidden behind black ink. And the mistakes themselves, they were just shocking. We're talking about unredacted names and even birth dates of minors, nude photographs, private phone numbers, and home addresses. Sometimes a name would be blacked out on one page, but then appear in full just a few pages later. Within just 2 days, lawyers were saying that the identities of over 100 survivors had been compromised. As you can imagine, the consequences from both the new information and from those terrible redaction failures were swift. They set off political and legal shockwaves that you could feel all the way from Washington to London. So what happened? Well, the DOJ scrambled and pulled thousands of documents back offline to review them again. In D.C., the House Oversight Committee summoned the Clintons to testify. And across the ocean, the fallout was just as intense. A major figure in the UK Labour Party resigned, and the pressure ramped up yet again on Prince Andrew to finally cooperate with U.S. investigators. And so once the initial storm started to pass, we were all left with this really profound and kind of unsettling question about what this whole thing was even for. You know, there's a huge difference between just having information and actually understanding something. Dropping 3.5 million pages on the world, well, it created an explosion of data, for sure. But what it didn't do was provide a clear story. It makes you ask a tough question. If you just release a mountain of raw data without any context, does that actually create clarity, or does it just create a kind of fog? And that's where we are now. The archive is open. But the case? It feels anything but closed. The debate that was started by the Epstein Files Transparency Act is still raging. Did this historic disclosure actually get us any closer to real accountability? Or did it just bury whatever truth was in there under an avalanche of information? Did it just create more noise, more confusion, and in the end, even more pain for the very people it was all supposed to help?